The attorney's office was silent except for the sound of papers sliding across a mahogany desk. Margaret's 3 children sat in a row, stiff, pale, confused. The lawyer cleared his throat and read the last line of the will one more time. The entirety of Margaret and Calloway's estate, valued at approximately $412,000, is hereby left to Mr. Daniel Rourke of Millfield, Ohio. Her son's jaw tightened. Her oldest daughter let out a sound that wasn't quite a word. The youngest stared at the wall. None of them had ever heard that name before. They had 3 days to contest it. 3 days to find out who Daniel Rourke was. What they found would unravel every story they had ever told themselves about their mother. Margaret Calloway had lived in the same cream-colored house on Birchwood Lane for 41 years. She had painted the shutters herself. Dark green. Her husband Gerald had chosen the color the summer before he passed, and she never changed it. That felt important to her, keeping small things the way they were meant to be. The color had faded slightly over the years, softened by Ohio winters and Ohio summers, and somehow that made it more right, not less. A color that had earned its place on the house. Gerald died in the winter of 2009. A heart attack. Quick, the doctor said, as if that was supposed to help. Margaret stood in the hospital hallway for a long time after they told her. She wasn't sure how long. A nurse brought her a cup of coffee she didn't drink. Someone asked if there was anyone they should call. She gave them Thomas's number because he was the closest geographically, and she couldn't think of any other reason to rank one child above another in a moment like that. Thomas arrived 40 minutes later. He was good in the immediate crisis. He handled the paperwork. He made the calls. He drove her home and sat with her until 11 that night, and when he left he squeezed her hand at the door and said to call if she needed anything. She told him she would. She never called. After that, Margaret was alone in a house built for a family. 4 bedrooms. A dining room with a table that seated 8. A backyard Gerald had mowed every Saturday from April through October with the precision of a man who found peace in straight lines. She kept the lawn service going after he died because she couldn't bring herself to let the yard go, and because maintaining it felt like honoring something she couldn't fully name. Her children, Thomas, 51, Sandra, 48, and Renee, 45, each had their own lives spread across 3 different states. Thomas lived 40 minutes away in Columbus. He worked in commercial insurance and coached his son's baseball team on weekends and was, by most measures, a good man living a full life. Sandra had moved to Charlotte 15 years ago for a job that became a career that became an identity. She was sharp, organized, successful, the kind of woman who color-coded her calendar and answered emails before 7 in the morning. Renee was in Denver, the youngest, always the most tender-hearted of the 3, always about to visit, always meaning to, always pulled sideways by the particular chaos of a life that never quite settled. Margaret understood. She told herself she understood. She kept the guest rooms clean anyway. Fresh pillowcases. A spare blanket folded at the foot of each bed. She restocked the guest bathroom with small soaps and a new toothbrush still in the package, just in case. She did this automatically, the way you maintain something you believe in even when evidence for it is thin. In the years after Gerald died, Margaret did what she had always done. She maintained. She endured. She sent birthday cards on time, real cards from the drugstore, chosen carefully, not the generic ones with the roses but the ones that had something specific written inside that she could underline or add a note beside. She remembered every grandchild's favorite color, their teachers' names, the sports they were playing that season, the small anxieties they had mentioned once in passing that adults usually forgot. She drove herself to doctor's appointments in the burgundy Buick she and Gerald had bought the year Renee graduated high school. She shoveled her own front walk until her back made that impossible, and then she hired the neighbor boy to do it, and then the neighbor boy went to college and she found someone else. She learned how to do her grocery shopping online when her knees got bad, watching 3 tutorial videos before she figured it out, never once calling Thomas to ask for help because she didn't want to be a bother. That word, bother, had attached itself to Margaret somewhere in her early 60s and never left. She wasn't sure exactly when it had arrived. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like weather, a gradual change in pressure, a slow shift in temperature, until one day she noticed she was cold and couldn't remember when she had stopped being warm. She had felt it the first time she'd started a sentence with "I probably shouldn't even ask," but, before finishing a request she had every right to make. She had felt it the time she called Thomas on a Sunday afternoon and heard the particular quality of his hello, and said, "I'll let you go, I know you're busy," before he'd said a single word about being busy. She had felt it when she started reducing herself in small ways, ordering less at restaurants, speaking more quietly in rooms, shrinking the space she took up so that no one would have to accommodate her. She stopped calling unless she had a reason. A real reason. Something practical. She stopped calling just to talk because just to talk didn't feel like enough of a reason anymore. She waited for them to call first. Some weeks they did. Most weeks they didn't. She told herself that was normal. Children grew up. They got busy. This was how it went. But there were moments, quiet Tuesday mornings when the house was so still she could hear the refrigerator hum from 2 rooms away, or Sunday evenings when the light came through the kitchen window at that particular angle that only happened in autumn, the angle that used to mean Gerald would be home soon, when the loneliness sat on her chest like something physical. Something with weight. She didn't tell anyone about those moments. She had a friend, Patrice, from church, who came by sometimes for coffee, and who was easy to be with in the way that women who have known each other for 30 years can be easy. She had her pastor, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Ellis, who checked on her more than he probably checked on others, and who she appreciated without ever saying so directly. She had her routines, the Tuesday Bible study, the Thursday library book club, the monthly lunch with 2 women from her old neighborhood who had also ended up alone and who understood, without discussing it, exactly what that meant. These things kept her. But they were not the same as family. And Margaret, who had spent 50 years at the center of a family, knew the difference precisely. She was not depressed. She was not falling apart. She got dressed every morning. She cooked real food. She read novels before bed and kept a small notebook where she wrote down sentences she wanted to remember. She laughed, genuinely easily, when something was funny. But she was lonely in the specific way that a person is lonely when they are surrounded by love that has grown distant. Not absent. Just distant. Love sent through the mail. Love that answered the phone but was always on the way somewhere else. She gardened. She had a plot along the south side of the house where she grew tomatoes, zucchini, a stubborn row of marigolds that came back every year without being asked. She found a rhythm in that work. Something reliable. The garden did not forget her between visits. The garden did not mean to call. The garden simply responded to attention consistently without complication, and Margaret found that deeply restful. She was out there on a warm morning in late May, 3 years before her death, kneeling beside the marigolds with a trowel, when she first became aware of someone standing near the fence. A man. Early 40s. Broad-shouldered but not imposing, the kind of build that suggested outdoor work somewhere in his past. He was holding a leash attached to a medium-sized brown dog who was looking extremely pleased with himself despite, or perhaps because of, the small amount of destruction he had recently caused at the base of Margaret's marigolds. The man looked mortified in the quiet, genuine way of someone who does not make excuses. He introduced himself over the fence. Daniel Rourke. He'd moved into the rental house 2 doors down 3 weeks ago. The dog was named Biscuit, which, he acknowledged without being asked, was perhaps not the most dignified name, but his daughter had chosen it and that was the end of the discussion. He apologized for the marigolds. He offered to replace them, however many, whatever kind. Margaret looked at the marigolds. Then at the dog. Then at the man who was still holding the leash with both hands like he was prepared to be held fully accountable. She told him the marigolds would be fine. They were survivors. They came back every year no matter what. He nodded. He thanked her. He pulled Biscuit back toward the sidewalk. Margaret watched him go and then looked back at her garden for a moment. Then she went inside and put the kettle on. Something about the morning felt slightly less quiet than it had before. She couldn't have explained it. She didn't try. Daniel Rourke was not what Margaret expected from a neighbor. She had lived on Birchwood Lane long enough to have known all kinds. The friendly ones who waved from driveways and never came closer. The intrusive ones who appeared at the door with casseroles and questions and stayed too long. The invisible ones who moved in and out like weather, leaving no impression either way. Daniel found the right distance without being told what it was. He waved when he saw her. Not the reflexive half-lift of a hand that people used to avoid eye contact, but a real acknowledgement, a nod that meant I see you rather than I have fulfilled my social obligation. He didn't linger. He didn't push. He existed in the neighborhood the way a good piece of furniture exists in a room, present, useful, unobtrusive, and somehow making the whole space feel more settled. The second time they spoke, it was over the fence again. He had noticed her struggling with a bag of garden soil and asked, from a respectful distance, if she wanted a hand. She said she had it. He said of course and went back to whatever he'd been doing. He didn't make her feel foolish for refusing. He didn't hover. He simply accepted her answer as valid, which Margaret had come to realize was rarer than it should have been. She started to notice him the way you notice something reliable. The way you notice that the newspaper always arrives before 6, or that the cardinal comes to the feeder every morning at roughly the same time. Not exciting. Just trustworthy. And in the particular quiet of Margaret's life, trustworthy had become its own kind of beautiful. One morning in early June she was out by the marigolds with her coffee when he came out with his. They didn't plan it. They didn't coordinate. They simply ended up on their respective sides of the low fence at the same hour, and it seemed rude not to say something, and so they talked. The weather. Then the garden. She told him about the tomatoes, which varieties she grew, which ones had disappointed her, which ones she kept planting anyway out of stubbornness. He asked real questions. Not polite questions designed to fill silence, but questions that showed he had been listening to the previous answer before forming the next one. He knew something about gardens, it turned out. Not a lot, but enough. His mother had kept one in western Pennsylvania when he was a boy, mostly vegetables, nothing ornamental. He described her rows of green beans with a quiet affection that told Margaret something important about the kind of man he was. People who speak warmly about their mother's small domestic efforts usually turned out to be worth knowing. These morning conversations became, without either of them deciding so, a loose kind of habit. Not every morning. Maybe 3 times a week. Sometimes only 5 minutes. Sometimes longer, if the light was good and neither of them had anywhere urgent to be. They never made plans. They never said same time tomorrow. It just happened the way good things sometimes happen, organically, without pressure, without anyone trying too hard. Margaret found she looked forward to it. She noticed that, and then she noticed that she had noticed, and she sat with that for a day or two without quite knowing what to do with it. It had been a long time since she had looked forward to something small. Gerald's death had taken a lot of things, and one of the quieter casualties had been the pleasure of small anticipations. The coffee ready, the familiar footstep on the porch, the sound of someone else in the house. Daniel didn't replace any of that. He wasn't trying to. But he reminded her that the capacity for it still existed somewhere inside her, waiting. By late summer she knew more about his life. The divorce had been finalized 2 years before he moved to Birchwood Lane. He spoke about it without drama, the way people speak about something painful that has been examined enough times to lose its sharp edges. He and his ex-wife Claire had married young and grown into different people with different needs, and had eventually arrived at the mutual, exhausted recognition that staying together was doing more harm than leaving. His daughter was named Sophie. She was 9. She lived with Claire in Ann Arbor, and he drove up every other weekend, 6 hours round trip, without complaint. He kept a photograph of her on his kitchen windowsill. He mentioned this once, just in passing, a picture from a camping trip the previous summer where she was holding a fish she'd caught and laughing so hard her eyes were shut. Margaret asked what kind of fish. He said she had absolutely no idea, and neither did Sophie, and that was part of what made the picture so good. Margaret laughed. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. She hadn't realized how much she missed laughing like that until it happened. She told him about Gerald that afternoon. Not everything, not all at once, but the shape of it. 43 years of marriage. The green shutters. The Saturday mowing, the straight lines. The way Gerald had always burned the toast but made the coffee exactly right, and how for years after he died she couldn't smell fresh coffee without it reaching her somewhere deep. Daniel listened the way people used to listen. No phone. No glancing away. No nodding slightly too quickly to signal that he had already understood and was ready to move on. He listened like what she was saying mattered, like he was in no particular hurry to be anywhere else, like the story of Gerald Calloway and his straight lawn lines and his perfect coffee was worthy of full attention. It was such a simple thing. It undid her, slightly, in the best way. Meanwhile, that same summer, something had begun shifting with her children. It was subtle at first. The kind of shift you feel before you can name it, a slight change in the temperature of conversations, a new quality in the questions being asked. Thomas had started stopping by more frequently. This, on its face, was a good thing. Margaret told herself it was a good thing. She made coffee when he came and put out the good cookies, the ones in the blue tin she kept for company, and she was genuinely glad to see him sitting at her kitchen table. Thomas looked like Gerald around the eyes, always had, and there was something about having him in the house that made the rooms feel less empty. But she started to notice the pattern in his visits. They would talk for a while about ordinary things, his son's baseball season, a renovation he was considering for their deck, something in the news. And then, gradually, inevitably, the conversation would find its way to the house. Its size. Its upkeep. The market in this part of Columbus, which was apparently very strong right now, very favorable, if someone were thinking about making a change. He never said it directly. Thomas was not a direct man. He circled. He suggested. He raised things as hypotheticals. Have you ever thought about some people in your situation it might be worth just looking into, and then backed away before anything became a real proposal? She understood what he was circling. She was 71. She lived alone. The house was worth something. These were facts, and she was not naive enough to pretend that money played no role in the concerns of adult children. She did not blame Thomas for thinking about it. She did not even blame him for raising it. What she noticed, quietly and without saying so, was that the visits had a purpose now. That the purpose was not her. Sandra's calls increased that fall as well. They were good calls on the surface. Sandra was attentive when they talked, asked about the garden, asked about the book club, asked about Patrice and Reverend Ellis and the various small elements of Margaret's life with a thoroughness that felt, at first, like genuine interest. But Sandra's calls, like Thomas's visits, had a gravitational pull to them. They circled and eventually arrived at the same place, the future. Margaret's future. What it looked like, whether it was planned, whether it was realistic. Sandra had researched assisted living communities. Several of them. She mentioned this carefully, framing it as information, not suggestion. She had just happened to come across some reviews, some ratings, some figures, and she thought Margaret might find it useful to have the information even if she wasn't ready to think about it yet. Margaret thanked her for the information. She did not look at it. She was still driving. Still gardening. Still hosting the Tuesday Bible study every third month and making the good lemon bars from scratch, not the mix because she had standards. She walked 30 minutes every morning unless the ice was bad. She managed her own medications, her own finances, her own calendar. She did not need a plan. She was the plan. But something had changed in how her children saw her, and she could feel it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure, not visible, not yet, but undeniably present in the air. They had begun to see her as a situation to be managed rather than a person to be known. She was not sure exactly when that had happened. She suspected it had been gradual. She suspected she had contributed to it without meaning to. All those years of saying I'm fine, don't worry, I have it handled, all those years of making herself small so as not to be a bother. She had performed self-sufficiency so convincingly that the people who loved her had eventually taken her at her word. And now, when she actually was still self-sufficient, they had stopped believing it. They had looked at her age and her empty house and her widowhood and made their calculations, and the calculations had come out the way calculations usually came out when applied to elderly women living alone on quiet streets. She sat with this realization for a long time. She didn't cry. Margaret rarely cried. She was the kind of woman who processed things slowly and privately, who came to her conclusions through a long interior conversation that nobody else was invited to witness. She got out her yellow legal pad and her pen. She sat at the kitchen table where she had sat for 41 years and she began, slowly and deliberately, to think about what she actually wanted to do. Outside, 2 doors down, a light was on in Daniel's kitchen. She could see it from her window, just a warm square of yellow in the dark, nothing dramatic. But she found herself looking at it for a moment before she turned back to her legal pad. Some lights, she thought, you don't even realize you're navigating toward until you're already moving. She picked up her pen and began to write. Thomas found the attorney's card on a Saturday in late March. He had come over to check the gutters, finally, after Margaret had mentioned them twice in passing over the previous 2 months, mentioning them the way she mentioned things she needed, carefully and without pressure, so that the person she was mentioning them to could choose to hear or not hear, and so that she could not be accused of demanding. She had learned to ask for things that way. She was not sure when she had learned it or whether it was a skill or a surrender. Thomas arrived around 10 with a ladder strapped to his truck and the particular energy of a man who has decided to be helpful and wants some credit for having decided. Margaret made coffee and put out the good cookies and stayed out of his way while he worked. She could hear him on the roof, the scrape of the ladder, his footsteps overhead, the occasional muffled commentary he directed at whatever he found up there. When he came inside to wash his hands, he was in a good mood. Gutters were clear, he said. Couple of shingles looked like they'd need attention before winter, but nothing urgent. He sounded like a man delivering a satisfactory report. Margaret poured his coffee and they sat at the kitchen table and talked for a while about ordinary things. His son Marcus had made the all-county baseball team. His wife Karen was taking a ceramics class on Thursday evenings and had produced, so far, 2 lopsided bowls and what might have been a vase. He told this story with real affection and Margaret laughed, and it was, for a little while, simply a good Saturday morning with her son. She got up to refill the coffee. When she came back, Thomas was looking at something on the counter. He wasn't touching it. He was just looking at it, the way you look at something when you're trying to decide whether you've actually seen it or whether your mind has assembled it out of fragments of anxiety you've been carrying around for months. Harrison and Briggs. Estate Planning and Elder Law. The card was cream-colored with dark blue lettering. Professional. Unambiguous. Margaret set the coffee pot down and sat back across from him. He looked up. His expression was careful, the expression of a man who had decided, in the 2 seconds available to him, to be casual about something he was not casual about at all. He said he didn't know she was working with an attorney. Margaret said she hadn't mentioned it. A pause. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car went slowly down Birchwood Lane. He asked if everything was okay. If there was something she was dealing with that she hadn't told them about. He said it gently. He said it with genuine concern layered over something else, something more alert, more calculating, that Margaret recognized because she had been watching for it. She told him everything was fine. She told him she was simply being responsible. She told him that a woman her age who didn't have her affairs in order wasn't doing anyone any favors. And she smiled when she said it, warm and easy, the smile she had perfected over decades of redirecting conversations she wasn't ready to have. Thomas nodded slowly. He said that made sense. He said it was actually a good idea, that he and Karen had been meaning to update their own documents. He said if she needed any help navigating anything, any of it, he was right there, 40 minutes away, she only had to ask. She thanked him. He finished his coffee, hugged her at the door, and drove away with his ladder rattling against the truck bed. Margaret stood at the window and watched him go. Then she went to her bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of the dresser, and moved the stack of folded sweaters to confirm that the actual documents, the ones Harrison and Briggs had prepared, the ones she had signed in February, were still exactly where she had put them. They were. She put the sweaters back and went to start lunch. What Thomas didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Margaret had been to Harrison and Briggs 4 times before that card ever appeared on her counter. The first visit had been exploratory. She had called the firm on a Wednesday morning in November, chosen them because Patrice's sister had used them years ago and spoken well of the experience. She had driven herself downtown, parked in the garage on 5th Street, taken the elevator to the 4th floor, and sat across from a junior attorney named Christine who was professional and patient, and who did not talk to Margaret the way some people talk to elderly women, slowly, with unnecessary repetition, as if age and wisdom were inversely proportional. Margaret appreciated that. She told Christine what she was thinking. Not everything, not yet. She wanted to understand her options first, wanted to know what was possible before she committed to what she wanted. Christine walked her through the framework. The instruments available. The legal protections in place. The ways a will could be structured and the ways it could be challenged, and what made the difference between a document that held and one that didn't. Margaret asked good questions. Christine seemed mildly surprised by this and then seemed to recalibrate, and after that they got along very well. The second visit was more specific. Margaret had gone home after the first meeting and spent 2 weeks thinking, the way she thought about everything important, slowly, thoroughly, turning it over in her mind the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath, and then turning it again. She came back to Christine with decisions made and language prepared. She knew what she wanted. She needed to know how to execute it correctly. Christine brought in the senior partner, a man named Warren Harrison who was in his late 60s and had the quality of someone who had spent 4 decades watching families at their worst and had arrived at a place of compassionate neutrality about human nature. He reviewed what Margaret was proposing. He asked several careful questions, not to challenge her, but to ensure that what she was describing was legally sound and, more importantly, that she was sound. That she understood what she was doing and why. She answered his questions directly and without hesitation. He said, after a pause that lasted just long enough to be meaningful, that in 38 years of practice he had seen a great many estate decisions, and that hers was among the most clearly reasoned he had encountered. Margaret thanked him and asked where she should sign. The third and fourth visits were about refinement. The letters were her idea. Harrison had not suggested them, they were not legally necessary, not part of the standard documentation. But Margaret had thought about them carefully and decided they mattered. Not for legal reasons. For human ones. She did not want to disappear without explanation. She was not interested in mystery for its own sake. What she wanted, what she had always wanted if she was being completely honest with herself, was to be understood. To have the truth of her experience witnessed by the people who should have been witnessing it all along. The letters were her way of making that happen. Her last act of communication with her children, composed at her own kitchen table over the course of 3 evenings with a good pen and the yellow legal pad, written and rewritten until every word was exactly what she meant. She gave the sealed envelopes to Harrison with specific instructions. They were to be distributed at the reading of the will. Not before. Not mailed separately. Handed directly to each of her children in that room on that day, so that they would read them in the context of everything else, the numbers on the page, the name they didn't recognize, the reality they had not prepared for. Timing, Margaret had always believed, was its own kind of language. The second thing her children didn't know was the diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer. The oncologist's name was Dr. Anita Sharma, a small, precise woman with dark eyes and the particular manner of someone who delivered devastating news regularly and had learned to do it without flinching, because flinching helped no one. She had told Margaret clearly and completely. The location of the tumor. The stage. The options available, what each one involved, what each one was likely to achieve. She used real words. She did not soften the edges so much that the shape of the thing disappeared. Margaret respected this enormously. She had driven herself home from that appointment. She had pulled into the garage on Birchwood Lane, turned off the engine, and sat in the car for approximately 20 minutes in the particular stillness of someone whose interior world has just been fundamentally rearranged. She was not in shock exactly. She was 71 years old and had lived long enough to know that the body was not a permanent arrangement. She had known this was coming in the abstract the way everyone knows it in the abstract. It was the specificity that required adjustment. The timeline. The particular shape of the ending. She sat until the adjustment was made, or as much of it as could be made in 20 minutes in a parked car in a garage in Ohio in November. Then she went inside and made dinner. She told 3 people. She told Dr. Sharma, obviously. She told Christine at Harrison and Briggs, because it was legally relevant and because Margaret believed in giving her attorney accurate information. And she told Daniel eventually on a cold evening in February when the diagnosis was 3 months old and she had carried it alone long enough. They were sitting on her front porch. It was too cold for the porch really, but Margaret had always thought better outdoors, and she had something she needed to think through out loud, and Daniel was the person she thought out loud with now. He had brought a blanket from his car without being asked. He had started doing things like that, small anticipatory things, without making them into gestures. She told him plainly. What it was. What the doctor had said. What the options were and what she had decided about them. She had elected to pursue a limited course of treatment, enough to manage symptoms and preserve quality of life, not aggressive enough to consume whatever time remained in the machinery of fighting. She had made this decision carefully in consultation with Dr. Sharma, and she was at peace with it. She wanted him to know that she was at peace with it, because she did not want him to spend their remaining time together trying to talk her out of anything. Daniel was quiet for a long time. He looked at the street. At the bare tree at the edge of the yard, its branches making clean lines against the winter sky. He had his coffee in both hands and he looked at it for a moment and then he looked back at her. He asked what she needed. Not what she was going to do. Not whether she had told her children. Not whether she had considered second opinions or alternative approaches or the remarkable advances being made in various clinical trials. Just what did she need? Margaret had not realized until that moment how much she had been bracing for the other questions. She felt something in her chest release, something she had been holding without knowing she was holding it. She told him she needed someone to drive her to treatments on the days she couldn't drive herself. She told him she needed someone who would not look at her differently after today. He said he could do both of those things. She nodded. He nodded. They sat on the cold porch until the coffee was gone. She tried to tell Thomas. She had planned it for a Thursday evening in February, 2 weeks after she told Daniel. She had rehearsed it, not word for word, but the shape of it, the sequence. She would tell him what it was, what the doctor had said, what she had decided. She would tell him she was not asking him to fix it. She would tell him simply because he was her son and she loved him and she wanted him to know. She dialed his number at 7:15. He answered on the third ring. She could hear the television in the background, something with crowd noise, a game, or a competition of some kind. His voice had the slightly distracted quality of someone who had picked up the phone from habit while their attention was elsewhere. She said his name. She said she had something she wanted to tell him. He said, and she would remember the exact quality of this, the particular sound of it, for the rest of her life. He said, "Oh, can it wait just a bit, Mom? Something's happening here. I'll call you this weekend." She said, "Of course." She said, "Talk soon." She hung up the phone and sat at her kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood surface and looked at the wall for a while. He called the following Saturday. They talked for 11 minutes about Marcus's baseball team and Karen's ceramics class. The conversation was warm and easy and entirely ordinary. She did not bring up the diagnosis. She never tried again. This was not a decision made in anger. Margaret examined it from all sides, the way she examined everything, and she was honest with herself about what it was and what it wasn't. It was not punishment. It was not a test that Thomas had failed and from which he could not recover. It was simply information, data about the nature of things as they actually were, stripped of the hopeful interpretations she had been applying for years like a coat of paint over wood that had already begun to rot. He had not been available. Not because something urgent had prevented him. Because something ordinary had distracted him. That was the truth of it, plain and unglamorous, and Margaret had arrived at a place in her life where she no longer had the time or the inclination to dress plain truths in more forgiving clothes. She thought about Sandra. She could have called Sandra. But Sandra's calls had been about management and options and Margaret's future, and Margaret did not want to become a project. She could not bear the thought of her diagnosis being researched, organized, and presented back to her with a list of action items and facility ratings. She thought about Renee, who was tender and would have cried and meant every tear, and who would have been genuinely devastated, and who would have called more often for a month before the rhythm of her own life reasserted itself and the calls tapered back down to occasional. Margaret loved all 3 of her children. This was not the same as believing they were capable of what she needed. She put the yellow legal pad away. She got out a different notebook, smaller, with a dark blue cover, and she began keeping notes of a different kind. Observations. Moments. The things she wanted to remember about her life while she still had the clarity to remember them. And on the first page, in her careful, unhurried handwriting, she wrote a single line at the top. What I know for certain. She sat for a moment with the pen above the page. Then she began to write. Margaret spent her last 8 months with intention. She was not reckless or dramatic about it. She was Margaret. She made lists. She organized her papers. She labeled everything in the house with small pieces of masking tape and a black marker. Who she wanted to have her mother's china, who should get the quilt from the cedar chest, where the deed to the car was filed. She had the green shutters repainted in May because the paint was peeling and she did not want anyone to inherit a neglected house. Daniel drove her to her treatments on the days she needed driving. He sat in waiting rooms reading paperback novels without complaint. He learned which soups she could keep down and which ones she couldn't. He fixed the leak under the kitchen sink without being asked, and when she thanked him he said it was nothing and meant it. He cried once in her kitchen when he thought she couldn't see him. She pretended she hadn't. Her children did not know about the treatments. They did not know about the soup or the waiting rooms or the way Daniel had quietly reorganized his own life to be available to her. Sandra called in June and said she was thinking about coming to visit in the fall. Maybe October. Margaret said that would be lovely and wrote the date on her calendar even though she doubted she'd make it to October. She made it to September. She died on a Tuesday morning in her own bed in her own house on Birchwood Lane. Daniel was there. Her pastor was there. A hospice nurse named Carol who had a laugh like gravel and a gentleness that Margaret had come to rely on. Her children were not there. They did not know she was that close. They found out by phone call 40 minutes after. The grief was real. Margaret never doubted that. She knew her children loved her in the way that people love things they have stopped paying attention to, fully, in theory, from a comfortable distance. The funeral was small. Daniel sat in the third row and did not speak to her children, who did not know who he was. 4 days later they sat in the attorney's office. Harrison read the will in full. The house. The savings account. The investment account Gerald had started in 1987 and Margaret had quietly maintained ever since. $412,000. All of it. To Daniel Rourke of Millfield, Ohio. Thomas went rigid. Sandra made a sound low in her throat. Renee asked the attorney to read it again. Harrison read it again. There was a sealed envelope included, one for each of them. Margaret had written the letters herself by hand in the months before she died. Thomas's letter was 4 pages. It began, "I tried to tell you on a Thursday night in February. You said you'd call me back." It did not accuse. It did not rage. It was Margaret, measured, clear, heartbreaking in its precision. She walked him through the 14 months. The treatments. The Tuesday mornings. The soup. The trail by the reservoir. The phone calls that came too late and left too quickly. She wrote, "I am not leaving my home to punish you. I am leaving it to the person who showed up. That is the only thing I know how to explain." Sandra's letter was shorter. It contained, near the middle, a single line that Sandra would repeat to herself for years. "You were planning my future. He was living in my present." Renee's letter was the gentlest. Renee had been the furthest away in miles and perhaps the least calculating in intention. Margaret seemed to know that. She wrote to Renee about Gerald, about the green shutters, about the marigolds that came back every year without being asked. She told Renee she had been loved. She told her that love and presence were not the same thing, and that Renee still had time to learn the difference. The 3 of them sat in the attorney's office for a long time after Harrison left the room. Nobody spoke. Outside the window, Columbus went on doing what cities do, indifferent, unhurried, unaware. Daniel Rourke did not move into the house on Birchwood Lane. He kept his rental 2 doors down. He maintained Margaret's garden through the following spring, the tomatoes, the zucchini, the marigolds. He kept the shutters the way she had left them. He eventually sold the property, but not quickly and not carelessly. He donated a portion to the hospice organization where Carol worked. He set up a small scholarship at the local community college in Margaret's name, for returning adult students, the ones starting over late, the ones the world had stopped expecting things from. He framed a photograph of the 2 of them at the reservoir and kept it on his bookshelf. Margaret's children did not contest the will. Thomas considered it. His attorney advised against it. But somewhere beneath the legal calculus Thomas knew in the way you know things you cannot say out loud, that contesting it would mean arguing that his mother had been wrong. And she hadn't been wrong. That was the hardest part. Not the money. The correctness of her. The lesson Margaret left behind was not about estate planning or legal documents, or who gets what when a life is finally sorted and closed. It was simpler than that. She had needed people who showed up. Not people who meant to show up. Not people who loved her from a distance and planned to visit in October. People who were there on the bad Tuesdays in the waiting rooms with the soup. She found one. She rewarded him. And she left her children with 3 days and the rest of their lives to understand why.